Everyone, and welcome to the fourth of our School of Prayer sessions. For those of us joining us for the first time, the idea of this is that we're looking really at that beautiful question that Jesus asked the disciples: Lord, teach us to pray. This real desire that we have to pray, to spend time with the Lord. And at the same time, all the struggles that we face, all the challenges, all the ways in which we fail to really love Him, and to all the ways in which we struggle with prayer. And so what we're doing here is not a simple kind of teaching a technique of prayer, or this is how you pray. It's going perhaps more deeply. What's the essence of prayer? And accompanying me during this whole series is St. Therese of Avila, who's given to us as a doctor of the church because he teaches us about prayer and has some really beautiful things to say about prayer. And as you can see, she's holding in her hands a castle. And you probably can't read the handwriting, particularly if you're watching online, because my camera's rubbish. And each week I keep promising you to have a new camera, which I've actually got and I haven't actually plugged in yet. But it's actually written in French because the statue comes from France. It says, "Un si grand seigneur habitait le petit palais de mon âme." Such a great lord inhabited the little palace of my soul. And this is really beautiful because this is really the heart of Teresa's realization. She realizes that God truly inhabits the soul. This isn't just a symbol, it's not just a kind of a nice image. But she asks the theologian, she's so astonished by this that she wants to check, is this really true? And yes, the theologian says, yes, God truly inhabits your soul. And this really forms the foundation of her teaching. And so we began to talk about her great work, The Interior Castle. This way in which she visualizes God being at the center of the castle. And that wonderful imagery that I was talking about last time of the walled cities. If you go to Avila, if you go to other of those sort of medieval walled cities, you have a kind of castle in the middle, and then outside sort of series of walls, concentric circles of walls, fortifications. And so this is the kind of image that she's using to show us kind of getting close to God, who's there all along at the center of our souls, but that we're perhaps discovering more and more as we go through. This is the imagery of the interior castle. So we're made for God. We know that. We're those who are of a certain generation might remember the Penny Catechism. Who made you? And you ask them that question, they really come back with, God made me. And then you say to them, why did God make you? And they say, to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him in this world, and be happy with Him forever, in the next. And then younger generation who didn't do Penny Catechism say, that's a really good question. I think the good thing about not having a pat answer is actually makes you think as well. Why am I here? So we're made for soul. We're made for God, rather. The soul is nothing else but the kind of paradise of God. And so, I think what's really interesting is to understand what's this presence like of God and the soul, because there's two presences, and this is important. So you might remember I said I'm following largely the schema of Blessed Marie Eugène of the Child Jesus in his masterwork, I Want to See God, but trying to sort of make it perhaps accessible, illustrating with some imagery and kind of experience. But nothing that I say is original, because nothing I ever say is original. I can't remember the last time I had an original thought. I'm basically giving you the thinking of Blessed Marie Eugène, which of course is not just his thinking. This comes from the tradition of the church, and he's read very deeply, particularly Aquinas, but also a lot of other people, and also it's the fruit of his experience of God. This is not just an academic teaching, it's really the fruit of lived experience. And you can see that in certain places in the book where it's very deeply his own lived experience. There's what he calls, first of all, the active presence of immensity, this sense of God being present everywhere. That God created everything, God is present in all things. And he's, yeah, um, the spirits, as we say, don't have a body, obviously, that sort of puts them into a particular place in time and space, as we are. The spirits, our guardian angel is close to us, but doesn't have a body. And the guardian angel is there because the guardian angel acts on our senses, on our intellectual kind of faculties, in order to help us, but in the form of a spirit, if that makes sense. It's not sort of a nice kind of angel sat on my shoulder, as you often see. It's a kind of deeper presence, this presence which isn't bodily. That's the really important difference that we have with the angels. I remember very vividly being at a conference in Garming in Austria, and the speaker said, of course, what we have, which the angels don't have, is a body. And of course, fortunately, the angels aren't envious of us. And then he kind of drew back and said, of course, yeah, the fallen angels. And the way in which the enemy so often attacks us through our body. You see that, in the first temptation of Jesus in the desert. It's to food, that sense of his physical hunger, and the enemy tempting him with bread, but the bread that doesn't come from God. And I think we see that very powerfully, the sense of the desert being a place of encounter with God, as I was saying last week, this real place where God comes to meet us, comes to reveal himself. But it's also the place of temptation. It's the place where spiritual choices become clearer. When you're in the city, we have lots of noise going on in the background, don't we? There's all the sort of stuff going on in our lives and all the busyness and all the activity and, everything else. When you're in the desert, there's not a lot going on, by definition. It's kind of, it's pretty barren. And yeah, so part of that is actually you've left behind all the stuff that's normally distracts you, all the stuff that keeps you busy. And actually, for that reason, the desert can be quite a tough place to be because it brings you face to face with God, but also with yourself, with all the things that actually perhaps you're not so comfortable with, and you're happier not facing, and that we can run away from through our activity, through our work, everything else. In the desert, when you don't have the activity, you're suddenly much more face to face with yourself, with all those bits of your heart that actually perhaps not so keen on facing. And you're face to face with the enemy. The enemy inhabits the desert also, and we see Jesus being driven by the Spirit, as we were saying, into the wilderness, and there he's tempted by Satan. And I think the desert is that place where we realize that we can't feed ourselves. That sense that we realize the limits of our own capacity. The desert is not a place where people naturally live because there's not much food. It's not an easy place to be. The desert spiritually is the place where actually I come to realize my dependence on God. At one level, I think I always kind of accept that. I say, yeah, of course, God is immense. Of course, I'm just a creature and I can't survive without God. But from on a day-to-day level, how often do I really live that? How often instead I'm very conscious of my competency, of my ability to kind of manage my own life. And it's only when I kind of really hit a brick wall, when I really hit something that really kind of, troubles me, that actually I realize, I can't do this on my own. And I turn to God in those moments of need. The desert, I think, brings us very starkly face to face with that, really kind of invites us to to see our need of God. And I think prayer, when we take it seriously, when we take it longer than is comfortable, is something of that desert experience. Because I can have times of prayer which are very easy, very nice. Often I start off by saying perhaps set prayers or asking God for things, and that's something that I control. I ask God for, I don't know, good health or nice weather. Please, Lord, give good weather this week, because I've hired a cherry picker at massive expense to do the redecoration of church windows. And we really need the weather to hold out because we've only got the cherry picker for a week. So yeah, I can do that. But then if I stay with prayer, there's a moment at which it's no longer quite so comfortable. There's a moment at which I think, well, that was nice. I'm happy to move on now. If I then stay with the prayer, if I really stay in the prayer longer than is comfortable, if I stay in the prayer and I make a commitment to a certain period of prayer every day, often that's when things begin to happen much more deeply in the spiritual life. That's why this School of Prayer, we're inviting you to have the half hour of listening to me. I mean, that's purgatory in itself. But then to spend half an hour in prayer on your own. I mean, longer if you want, but to try and spend at least half an hour before the Lord, just to have that time really with Him. And that's often, for people who haven't done it before, where we start encountering problems. First couple of minutes are really nice, maybe the first 5 minutes or 10. And then I get to a point where actually I perhaps run out of things to say, to think, and I'm feeling a bit kind of tired. I've got other things to do. I could go off and have some nice supper, or I stay with the prayer. And that's where I get into that experience of desert. Because in the desert, I'm feeling hungry. I'm feeling that kind of sense of a lack of something. There's a lack of something in me. There's a lack of patience to stay with the prayer. There's a lack of love in me. I hear those words of Jesus to the disciples, could you not stay with me but 1 hour? And actually, I'm really struggling to do even half of that. I'm really struggling to stay with the prayer. And I can really feel that kind of battle inside of me. Prayer, as I was saying before, is a spiritual battle. A battle, first of all, to sit down and pray. And then when I started praying, to actually stay with the prayer. And so it's a real experience of the desert. And actually, the enemy can make himself present in all sorts of different ways. I'm not going to say very much about the enemy's action, because there's a whole chapter on this a bit later on in I Want to See God. I'm kind of doing this a bit chronologically to kind of follow the logical order. But it's helpful to know. I think you want to describe for the balance. You don't want to see the devil on every shoulder and get obsessed with. No, but I think it's the devil is real, and he will try and act against us, particularly as we start to grow towards God. And it's very helpful to know what the devil can do, what the devil can't do, and how the devil can work in different ways at different stages of the spiritual life. I think that really helps in terms of, being strong in standing up to him, strong in faith. But coming back to the desert, it's the place of encounter with God, and that place where we realise our thirst for God, our longing for God, in that hunger. And I think if we stay with that, we begin to discover God's presence more and more. So I was talking about those two ways in which God is present. So this active presence of immensity, the sense that God is everywhere, in everything. There's not one of the tiniest particles of my being where God isn't present. God is totally present in all that I am. He's one who gives me movement, gives me life. And in a different way to plants and animals. St. John of the Cross, who often speaks in imagery, has this very vivid kind of poetic language, says that he passed in haste through creation. So you have the sense of a trace of God's presence, but it's just a trace. I think that lovely image of God passing in haste, that we see the way in which, the beauty of creation can draw us towards God. I'm sure you have things in creation that really make you think, wow. I love when I'm in places in the countryside, when I can look up at night and see the stars and really kind of, think, wow, this is just so amazing and awe-inspiring. I remember when I was 14 and I started doing astronomy GCSE, and I'm just fascinated by looking and learning more about the universe and the immensity of that. Or it might just be a tiny thing like a flower or something that makes you think, this God is present. But of course, God is present in a different way in the human person than he is in a flower, a plant, an animal. God's breath, ruah, you remember that wonderful creation account. Those of you who heard me talk before will have probably heard me talk about Freddie, poor Freddie, who was in a confirmation retreat with me some years ago. He was the sister who was leading this session decided to do a recreation of the creation account. So she got someone to volunteer to be God the Father, who got to sit in his throne, and he had the keys of the kingdom in his hand, and then Freddie got to be Adam. So he got to lie on the floor. She said to God the Father, right now you can shape and make Adam. So God the Father kind of lifted one of his arms up and one of his legs, and he was kind of like this on the floor. And so she said, what's Adam missing? And Freddie said, my dignity. Of course, it wasn't quite the answer she was looking for. The answer she wanted was the life, the breath of God, which gives us life. But this breath, which means that we have the life of God already in us, that life of God, is in the very depth of our heart and soul, that we are already sharing in that life of God. But as well as that, this life that's given to us by God, there's a second presence. There's an objective presence, which is given to us by God. And this is what we're discovering in prayer. This is the way in which God is becoming more and more present. And so, this way in which the divine activity of that sort of presence of immensity, that presence which is always there, sustains and enriches the soul, but kind of leaves it passive under God's gifts. There's a sense in which we passively receive the gifts of God through that, presence of immensity. It creates between God and the creature relationships of creator to creative one, basically. So we have the creator and we have the creation. But this is really exciting. This is what Teresa's discovering. That grace gives a power to the soul to react under the gifts of God, through the gifts of God, to come back towards him, to kind of turn towards God, to know him directly as he is known. This is really beautiful. To love him as he himself loves himself. Isn't that beautiful? We get to love God with that same love that's at the heart of the Trinity. Isn't that amazing? I mean, clearly, you have to kind of qualify that and say, obviously, in a limited creaturely way, by participation but it is true that we're called to share in the very life of God himself through the love that's in the heart of the Trinity. That is amazing. This is what we're going to in prayer. And really to know God as a father, And this beautiful way in which now, you remember the first relationship was one of creator to creature. That's the presence of immensity. Here, with this presence in the soul, the subjective presence in the soul through grace, we have a way in which the relationship is no longer just creature and creator. It's this reciprocal friendship, this filial relationship that we can have with God, that we can really call God our Father, that we can call God a friend. I'm a friend of God. This is amazing. It doesn't stop God being creator, being immense. He's not just my friend, of course, but he really allows us to have these very deep relationships in which he draws us into his very own life. That sense that God, through that presence of immensity, filled the soul, is really totally present in us, but like a stranger, like someone we don't know. You can see that. It's lovely seeing people coming to faith, and I just have such a joy when I see people really just discovering God and kind of. But there's a moment in which, suddenly, something happens. But even before that, God was present, but they just didn't know. They didn't realize, they didn't believe, they didn't have any sense. Whereas with a soul that's enriched through grace, God gives himself, as I was saying, as a friend, as a father. There's that sense in which, through that immense presence of immensity, God reveals himself indirectly through his works, through his creation, through everything else. Here he reveals himself directly. He really helps us to discover his intimate life, that intimate life at the heart of the Trinity. We get to enter into that. We really, as sons, as daughters, enter into that life of the Trinity, to share in it. And that's the really exciting thing. Through this relationship, we can say this new presence of God, this, what we were saying, is a kind of objective presence of God, to give it a kind of terminology as Father Marie-Eugène does. Because God can now be known directly. Before he was just known indirectly through his creation, through that sense of his works. Whereas through this objective presence, you can objectively have a sense of being able to have a sense of God that we can know and love. So you can truly know and love God directly. Isn't that amazing? It's so exciting. Those two presences are not exclusive. They're not sort of mutually exclusive. It's not like you can have, I'll have this one or that one. This is the joy of being Catholic, as one of my friends says, that you can have strawberries and cream. This is like, it's not an either or. We have this sense of the two presences kind of coming together and complementing each other in the soul. Now, this might all seem quite abstract and a bit kind of, but bear with me, because it actually is so fundamental and important. You're going to see, it's just beautiful. Let's skip on a bit. So this beautiful phrase of scripture, which is in where is that? John 14:23. If someone loves me, my Father will love him, and we'll come to him and make our home in him. This is what we're really exploring. That beautiful John 14 promise of Jesus. So where is this presence of God in the soul? It's really, you remember this lovely image of the castle. It's the most central of the mansions. This real sense of God's presence being absolutely central and really kind of the heart of who we are. And so she says that in the mystical union that you get to in the fifth mansion, so remember there's 7 kind of mansions, 7 dwelling places, 7 whatever you translation you want to use. But yeah, 7 kind of gradual, and in the 5th mansion, the mystical union, she says, His Majesty introduces and places us in the center of our soul, where it's united in a manner that's so tightly, so bound to the essence of our soul that the demon doesn't dare to approach, and doesn't even dare to know this secret. It's so deep that God doesn't even entrust it to our understanding. It's something that kind of goes beyond our intelligence, our understanding. It's this very deep kind of mystical union. This is one of the other exciting things that when you get this is something to aim for as well. So I'll tell you what to really aim for in a moment. But actually, a kind of lesser thing to aim for is that as you grow in the spiritual life, you're gradually freed from mortal sin, and you get to a point where actually the demon doesn't have any more power. It's just amazing. So there's something to kind of get excited about. Yes, and then coming back to Saint Teresa, you'll see later on in the final dwelling place, for a final mansion, adds the saint, how His Majesty wants the soul to taste His presence in the heart of herself in a much better way than here. So already in 5th mansions, you've got mystical union, but when you get to 7th mansions, then you're going to really kind of taste this presence of God in such a beautiful, deep, and intimate way. So this obviously comes from Teresa's own mystical experience. This is a kind of mystical experience. It's not just hers. You remember I was, for those of you who heard the previous talks, I was saying that she gives us a kind of pattern for the spiritual life. Everyone's life of prayer is different, but you tend to find that there's a certain pattern in the spiritual life. The actual experiences will be different, but there's a common thread, a common theme. And you'll find that kind of theme is what she describes. So often people think, well, I pray in a kind of Ignatian way, or a Dominican way, or this kind of or Benedictine way, or and all of those are valid, but there's a kind of a deeper thread that goes behind all of those. That goes beyond any kind of technique of prayer, that kind of takes you into the heart of God. So the technique can be useful, can be really helpful, particularly as you begin the spiritual life. But I think it's important not to get too tied to a particular technique, because that technique might work for you, and it might work at a particular point in the spiritual life, but it won't necessarily work for your neighbor, and it might not necessarily work for you later on. And often one of the really difficult things for people as they grow in the spiritual life is that they've had this beautiful technique that's worked really well, and then suddenly it stops working, and they think, what's happening? Has God abandoned me? And actually God's calling you to a deeper life of prayer. Be willing to let go of even a really fruitful technique, because actually God might be calling you deeper. So I'll just say that now. So, as Blessed Marie-Eugène says, this mystical experience, which is so clear, invites us to a kind of inquiry. It invites us to look a bit more deeply. We discover that rather than sort of resting just on an illusion, this experience illustrates very beautifully a truth, a very deep truth. That is that if God acts in the whole of our being as the author of the natural order, as we said, in that presence of immensity, he places that grace, his grace, only in the most spiritual part of our soul. So that presence of immensity is in everything of you. The tiny bit of your fingertips. That's God is there, but it's only that most spiritual interior part of our soul which is capable of receiving that participation in the divine nature. Does that make sense? It's that real kind of very deep, intimate part. It's in this essence of the soul, this really kind of deep part, in which grace is inserted in this in the roots of the faculties on which are grafted those theological virtues, in which God communicates himself to the soul and gives himself. Now, that takes quite a lot of unpacking, and I've got about, in fact, minus 1 second left. So I'll begin next week by unpacking what do we mean by theological virtues, and for those of you who aren't familiar with that kind of language, and how does God graft himself onto those faculties of the soul, because that's really quite important. But please don't get put off if this seems a bit abstract and you think, this is just completely useless. Why is Father Tom waffling about this kind of random abstract stuff? Actually, you'll see how beautiful and how practical and how important it is. So yeah, to encourage you, please bear with me. And thank you for your patience. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.